the recording. And then I'm going to screen share. Um, so I'll start off with just very quickly, let me just make sure I'm recording. Okay, yeah. So let me just quickly start with like an overview of what this meeting is going to be about. And it's about the topic of spinning and looking at it from the perspective of pole dancing and also research. And we have two different objectives. The first is to bring together different disciplines and learn something that's new and exciting. And to do that, we have three different speakers. The first will be Liz, who will talk about pole dancing and spinning. The second will be yours truly, and I'll talk about spatial disorientation and spinning, and also sort of like a spaceflight analog condition that leads to spatial disorientation. And then Joel is going to talk about motion sickness and spinning. And then the second goal is to bring together different communities and have them socialize and have chill session and have exploratory brainstorming that leads to the birth of novel ideas and hopefully even artwork. And a part of the community, as all of you have heard, we've got people with backgrounds in research and academia, people who have backgrounds in dancing, we have high school students, we have some Brandeis alumni, we have some people from industry. So it's really, really cool group of people that we have. And so we'll start off, oh yeah, and so the schedule is going to be the following. So 8 to 9 p.m., it's going to be these three presentations, and then we'll have like a standard question and answer session. And then this will be recorded and we'll put it on YouTube. And we'll try to hold the questions until the absolute end. And then the next part, which will be about like 20 minutes, and this part's optional, so no stress if you have to go. But those people that are interested, I'd love to put people into breakout rooms, or if our group is small and intimate, like it is right now, we could all sort of be there and just get to know one another a little bit better, socialize, hang out, chill. And then also from there, do some sort of exploratory idea generation that eventually I would use to create an artistic flowchart. And I would create it with this really cool group. We call it TRIG, which stands for, what is it? Technology Research Interdisciplinary Group. It's basically just a bunch of us who talk about the relationship between humans and technology and idea generation, stuff like that. Okay, so I'll give an introduction into Liz, and then she will take it from there. So Liz is a lifelong contemporary dancer and improviser. 8 years ago, she discovered the art and sport of pole dance and fitness. Since then, she's been an avid member of the pole community, participating as a student, performer, and instructor. Liz is currently the assistant coordinator of dance at BU and holds a master's of science in physical therapy. And she is thrilled to share her sensory experiences on the pole and to engage in discussion. So let me exit screen sharing and let me spotlight Liz and spotlight. Okay.
Great. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining. It's really exciting to see so many familiar faces and new faces. I'm happy to have this opportunity to speak with you, and I'm going to be speaking mostly from the perspective of a pole dancer today, but a lot of this stuff is interesting to me and harkens back to some of what I studied when I was doing physical therapy and working with people there. So this is really interesting to me on many levels, and my past and my present and perhaps the future too. So thanks for joining. And I actually prepared a collection of videos for us to share because it's also easier than me jumping on and off a pole while I'm trying to speak to you. So we're going to go back and forth between me speaking and the videos. And the first couple of videos are more just sharing some information about pole that a lot of people don't realize. And I think for pole dancers, it seems very basic and we don't even share it with people. So talking about things like gripping the pole and why having skin available is necessary. Also speaking about the fact that there are static poles and spin poles. A lot of people don't know that there are two different kinds of pole, one that spins and one that doesn't. And that really changes the way you view what you're seeing when you know if it's the person who's generating the spin or if it's the pole. So I think we'll just dive in and watch those first two videos and just give you some of the background information that I like to share with people who are not from the pole community.
All right, so I'm going to screen share and let's see, go to my PowerPoint. Second, and then I will start first video. Okay, let me just make sure you can hear this. Stop screen share. Let me just screen share again. Okay. Okay.
Before we get started, I wanted to share some information about pole that a lot of people don't know. And some of these basic things can really change how you view pole dancing or what you think you're seeing when you watch. So one of the things that's really important in pole dancing is grip. And that's how well you can grip the pole or how well your skin can grip the pole. And while sometimes in some settings, the clothing worn has an aesthetic value, generally when we're practicing pole dancing or in pole dance classes, we are still wearing the same small amount of clothing because our skin needs to grip the pole. So clothing doesn't grip, skin does grip. So where you have clothes, you can't expect to hold on to the pole, and there's a lot of moves where you have to hold with your knee or with your thighs or even your waist wrapping around the pole. So any area that you hope to use to help secure your body in the air needs to be available and not covered in clothing. So that's a useful thing to know when you think about poling. Another thing is that we use things called grip aids to also assist with that. And sometimes dry hands is a really popular one, and it's an anti-perspirant, so it really dries out the skin if you have just natural oil in your skin, or if you're sweating. This helps get rid of that and helps improve your grip. Also, we have things like tack, which actually is quite sticky, and you put that in very specific areas that you might need to grip with commonly. If you're doing elbow grips or behind the knee grips, that's a common place to put just a little bit of that tack to help make sure you have a secure grip on the pole. Another thing that makes a big difference is temperature. Different people pole better in different weather because our skin, as it is warmer or cooler, may stick better to the pole. Also, as the pole heats up from your dancing, you may have better or worse grip. Some people sweat easily and their grip decreases rapidly when it gets warm. I grip much better in warm weather. So that's also another variable from person to person and can also change what your pole experience is like in different settings. If you're in a room that's highly air conditioned, you may love it, or for me, that's a really bad situation for me to try to pole in. So just something you may not think about, but the temperature of the surfaces and how they interface, that's something that we deal with that an audience member or viewer would not know. Also, you may sometimes see people wiping down the poles with alcohol. This is not for hygienic, although it's nice. It's nice to have a clean pole. It's nice to wipe your pole down. But again, it's the idea of removing any sweat or oil or residues on the pole. So you may dance for a little bit and then have to stop and wipe the pole down so that you can have a decent grip again. So that first pole detail was grip.
Okay, and here's a second video.
The second thing a lot of people don't know is that poles can be static poles, which means that they don't spin, or spin poles, which means they spin. And there are a lot of poles that are actually both, and simply by taking out a screw or adjusting a mechanism on the pole, you can switch it from spin mode to static mode. But when you are watching those videos and the person is going around and around and around and around, it's a spin pole. However, spin poles are not motorized. Some people think that spin poles are, yes, they spin, but you have to make them spin. You have to generate the force and manipulate your shape in space to use that force to speed up, or you can change your shape to help slow the spin down. So that spin pole, static poles don't spin at all. So when people spin on static poles, it's literally their body, their hand that's moving around the pole, as opposed to the pole spinning in the base. So I'm just going to show you a couple of things where I will do a few things on a static pole, and then I'll do those same things on a spin pole.
Liz, is there anything you want to say, or should I move on to the other videos?
No, I think just that what you'll see now is just a couple of demonstrations of, like I just said, of the moves, the same move done on a pole set on static setting, and then the same move done on spin, just how you can see that I'm not doing anything hugely different in terms of the movement or technique. It's just interacting once the pole is unlocked and on spin.
Awesome. And so should I show like the next two videos?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Actually, you can probably show the next 1, 2, 3. I think actually the next 6 will just bounce back. They're short videos, just bouncing back between static and spin. So you can just let them.
Just do all of them? Okay, cool. Screen share, and
I'm going to show you some basic moves on static pole and then spin pole. The first is the basic climb. So I'll do the same thing on the spin pole in a minute, but this is what I did. This is just a climb on static.
okay, and then the next one.
I will do the spin version. So this is a climb on spin. And you can see I could keep spinning and spinning, well, for a while.
All right, and now the next one.
The next thing I'll demonstrate is what's called a chair spin. And again, this is a static pole. This is the static version of a chair spin.
And next.
This is a chair spin on spin pole. And again, I could keep going for a while. Do climb into a sit, and then I'll just tuck my legs in. And then this will be a climb into a sit, and then tucking the legs in. And here you can see that I could spin and spin and spin. If I want to slow my spin down, unsurprisingly, if I spread out, and then if I tuck again, we spin a lot more. So from there you can see that those were basically the same moves done on static pole and spin pole.
And then this one. All right, they're just beautiful videos. Thanks for sharing. Liz, any things you want to say after that?
No, I think probably it will be more interesting hearing what questions people have sort of when we take what you just saw and now we layer on all these other aspects, and then having more of a dialogue at the end, or taking questions then.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, we're probably going to hold questions till the absolute end. But yeah,
Yeah,
thank you, Liz. I
exactly.
mean, just like really amazing and interesting stuff. And then let me share my screen. So now I will give a small presentation, which is sort of like thoughts about research that these videos inspired in me. So let me screen share, share, and let me, okay. All right. So hi, my name is Vivek and I'm a research scientist in the Ashton Graybiel Spatial Orientation Lab at Brandeis University. So, what I'll first start off with is a quick story about astronauts going to Mars. And part of what's going to be exciting about this presentation is how am I going to connect astronaut going to Mars to pole dancing? So imagine that you are an astronaut and you're headed off to Mars and you spend months and months and months in zero G, in outer space, where if I blindfold you, the concept of up doesn't even exist. I just want you to just let that idea sink into your mind, because right now, every moment of your life, whether consciously or unconsciously, has some element of like, where is up and how things fall and how things move. And you take all of that away, and for months, the concept of up doesn't really exist. And then comes the day when you have to land upon the surface of Mars. And now you have to go from really no concept of up to all of a sudden knowing where up is a matter of life or death, because you have to stabilize that spacecraft as it lands upon the surface. And what we know is that in that transition, as astronauts go from zero G to Mars G, during that initial descent, they will become susceptible to spatial disorientation. And all that vocab word means is that they won't really know which way they're oriented relative to up. They won't know exactly where up is, and that can be fatal. That can be, lead to actual death. And the reason why I say that is here on Earth, like you can forget Mars or the moon, here on Earth, spatial disorientation in military pilots has a fatality rate of almost 100%. So that's pretty scary. Like people are actually dying from this. And this is a problem not only for military pilots, but also, commercial pilots and private pilots, civilian pilots. This is a really big problem. And so the next question is, well, how do we study something like this? How do we recreate a space flight condition here on Earth in a lab at Brandeis? How is that possible? How do you recreate a condition where people can't really rely on gravitational information to figure out which way they are oriented? And the way that I do it is the following. Now, the first thing I'm going to show you is not my spaceflight condition. This is my control condition. In this condition, people know where they are. I'll describe this first, and then I'll describe the spaceflight condition. So here you see what I do is I strap people into the machine. In this case, it's me, and I'm actually wearing pants that I designed. These are my predator prey pants. My mom has sewed them for me. And the machine is programmed to behave like an inverted pendulum. And all that means is trying to balance a pen on your fingertip. And just like trying to balance a pen on your fingertip, if you do nothing, the pen just falls over to one side. In that same way, this machine is programmed to fall over to one side or the other. And what you'll also notice is that there are crash boundaries. So if you go too far, the machine will sort of stop, like right there, and then it'll start to reset back to the balance point, back to the vertical. Now, what I tell my participants is to grasp that joystick and balance themselves to the best of their ability at that 0 degree point, at that balance point, right at the vertical. And what you notice is that the participant here is blindfolded. And one reason for blindfolding people is that it really exaggerates the effects of spatial disorientation. And in real life, when pilots are flying at night or through clouds, or when a helicopter pilot is near the ground and It throws up a bunch of dust in the air. It's called brownout. You can't see anything. This is where the greatest dangers are, and pilots get disoriented. So we blindfold people. But you may ask, well, okay, I did say that I know where I am, in terms of my orientation. How is that possible? What sensory information am I getting? So I'm not getting any visual information because I'm blindfolded. I'm not getting any auditory information because I wear noise canceling headsets. I am getting information, through my somatosensory system, through the touch receptors on my skin as I push against that machine. And I'm also getting some information, or a lot of information, through my vestibular system. And this is something that a lot of people may not know. So what I'm going to do to help describe it is we are all going to go on a magic school bus ride right into the inner ear. And in the inner ear is where the vestibular system resides. And the vestibular system has two components to it. The first are the semicircular canals. And these are, three semicircular canals, all at 90 degrees to each other. You've got one on each side of your head. And they're canals filled with fluids, and they have little hairs inside them. And those hairs deflect once you rotate. So for example, if you're a pole dancer and you're spinning like this, your head's rotating around the pole, those little hairs are deflecting, saying, hey, you're spinning in this yaw sort of spinning experience that you're having. Really, all I want you to take away from this slide is that your canals give you a sense of angular acceleration. They just give you motion information. How fast are you spinning? The second part of your vestibular system are your otolith organs. And the otolith organs are these fine little hairs that are suspended in gelatinous material, and they're adorned. They're adorned by crystals, believe it or not. And what they detect is linear acceleration. And really, for my presentation today, the most important thing that they detect is tilt from gravitational vertical. The more you tilt from vertical, the more you tilt from upright, the more gravity, sort of, you could say, is pulling on those crystals, which causes the hairs to deflect. So, if you're at 30 degrees, those hairs will deflect, and you'll get a sense that, oh, I'm 30 degrees tilted from this upright position. And the more those hairs will deflect. And that's why I say that this is gravitational cues. You can use gravity to figure out how far away you are from the balance point, which is right at that 0 degree point, right where that green line is. So as a very quick summary for my first condition, the control condition, where people have a good sense of where they are, it's because from their otoliths, are getting gravitational information. They can use gravity to figure out how far away they're from the balance point, because the balance point is right at 0 degrees. And from their canals, they're getting information about motion, and from their skin receptors, they're getting a mixture of both. Now, my second condition, which I call my space flight analog condition, and it's also the condition that pole dancers will be experiencing, because you can see I'm kind of spinning, about an axis, just like a pole dancer would. So first of all, this may look a little bit confusing, but it's the exact same dynamics as what you have seen before. It's inverted pendulum dynamics. So basically what happens is if you do nothing, the machine will just twist to the left or twist to the right. And the task that the participant has is use the joystick and just balance it right at that center point, right where the person is facing the camera. Now, why do I call this a space-like condition? Well, if you remember in the control condition, the further you were away from the balance point, the more those hairs reflected, and so you could figure out how far away you are from the balance point. But here, what happens is that you're always upright. So those otolith hairs are always just pointing up. And you could be tilted 10 degrees or 20 or 30 or 40. It doesn't really matter, because those otolith hairs are just saying, hey, you're up, you're up, you're up, you're upright. And you're not getting any information about how far away you are from that balance point. In other words, you just can't use gravity to figure out how far away you are from that balance point. And again, I just kind of want to stress this. What makes this a spaceflight condition is not specifically the movement itself. It's the fact that you can't use gravity to figure out which way you're oriented, to figure out where that balance point is. Now, what's also sort of important to mention here is that you are getting some sensory information. So from your semicircular canals, you are getting some information about how fast you're rotating through your semicircular canals. And this is just like a quick aside for people who enjoy neuroscience. this idea of taking velocity and making an estimate of position is called angular path integration. And again, the idea is that that angular velocity information is sent to a neural integrator in your brain. And that neural integrator does a simple calculation. For example, velocity multiplied by time equals distance, that in a simplified way. And so you can make estimates of how far you've gone just based on velocity and time. And so, this has been shown that we have these things in our brain. There's experimental evidence that shows that people are actually kind of accurate at being able to do this. So one would say, based on the literature and prior experiments, the literature would probably guess that people should be able to do the space flight pole dance sort of task pretty well. Maybe error will accumulate as time goes by, but it shouldn't be too extreme. But what we find is drastically different. And I'm not really going to go over the data. I'm just going to give you the juicy conclusions, which is that in the control condition, where people can use gravitational information to figure out the balance point, everyone shows significant learning, classic learning curves. But in the space flight condition, in that pole dancing condition, there's very minimal learning collectively as a group. There are individual differences, but as a group, there's very minimal learning. And there's also very poor performance. And what's more is that 90% of people say that they don't really know where they're oriented. And what's even more unusual is that people report all sorts of like wicked weird like experiences. They feel like they're spinning 360 degrees, or they feel like they're oriented in a completely different way than they actually are. It's a really fascinating place, to be. Now, just to give you like further idea of like the drastic and unbelievable differences between the control condition and the space flight / pole dancing condition, here is some raw data for you. And what you see here on the x-axis is just time. And this is trial 20. So this is like the last trial. The person has mastered the task. And this is the control condition, where they have relevant gravitational cues. They have a good sense of where they are. The black line is the angular position. And again, and the green line is the target. It's the 0 degree points. It's the balance point. And what you see here is a person goes a little bit to the right, goes a little bit to the left. This oscillates around this green line, just doing a beautiful job. Nice, tight, small oscillations. Now, what I can also do in this experiment is I had people press a button every time they felt like they were at that balance point, just to see, are they perceiving the balance point correctly? And sure enough here, that's what the purple dots are. Everyone is very accurate with knowing where that balance point is, because it's right at gravitational vertical, and you can use your otoliths to figure out right when you're at the upright. So it's wicked easy. Now let's take a look at what happens in the space flight condition. Now, you already know that people are going to be bad at that space flight condition, because I already told you that people are really bad at it. But now the question is are they just going to be randomly bad, or is there a pattern in their badness? And what we take a look at here, this is just really fascinating. This is the space flight condition. It's trial 20, so the person's been in it for about 40 minutes. And what you see is that they start off first at 0 degrees, and then all of a sudden, they begin to get further and further away from the balance point. And what's really unbelievable is that as early as 10 seconds, they're already 20 degrees away. Like they're getting, and again, no like actual vestibular model is really able to capture this rapid rate of losing sense of your ability to balance. So this person gets further and further away until they hit the crash boundary. Now, every participant shows this pattern of behavior. But here is the really golden and interesting question, which is, what are they actually perceiving? It could be that they know exactly where the balance point is, they're just not able to reach it. Or it could be that while they're over here, they actually feel like they're at the balance point. So they have an incorrect perception of where they are. So what is the actual truth? So I asked them to trigger press whenever they feel like they're at the balance point. And what we find, again, blows my mind, is that these people are actually perceiving that they're far away. I mean, this person, I just want you to kind of appreciate what's going on here. This person's at 50 degrees, right? They're right at the jaw of death, if I may be dramatic, okay? They're right at the crash point, okay? And they are feeling as if, oh, I'm right at the balance point. everything's okay, everything's comfortable, I'm doing a great job, I'm at the balance point. But really, within a second or two, bam, they crash the machine. And they say, whoa, I had no idea that I was so far away. I just couldn't believe I'm so far away. This is what they verbally say. It's a very, very unusual and interesting condition. And you can just imagine that if you're an astronaut or a military pilot and you're thinking you're 50 degrees away from where you are, that could be pretty debilitating. That could be pretty bad. Now, as I was talking to Liz, one of the questions I had is that maybe pole dancers would have a better sense of where their angular position is, which way they are, because they've been spinning like this quite a bit. And what I should also say is that I've ran dancers and gymnasts, and they typically don't perform that much better than the average population. But what Liz also told me is that, like, dancers and gymnasts, they will often, when they're spinning, do visual fixation, where they as they're spinning, they spin and they're just staring at a single point. And when I blindfold them, they're missing that. Whereas pole dancers, I think typically or often may not always do visual fixation. So maybe, who knows, they may have the ability to do it. So Liz was really awesome, and she did an experiment, and she's going to describe it in this video right here.
The last thing I want to show is experimenting with this idea of whether or not I can tell where the front is with my eyes closed. So we'll see how well you can see my face, but basically I'm going to go up and spin, and then at some point close my eyes, and then try to say front when it's my perception that I am facing the front or the camera. So we'll see what happens. Front, 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 front. Oh. The last thing.
Okay, so I mean, you could see that she was kind of accurate, but then as time went by, some error was accumulating. Now, again, we're not going to know whether pole dancers have better perception of where they are as they spin, and that might be a really cool experiment for us to run in the lab. Like, bring in a few people who've done pole dancing for a while and see, is their perception of where they are when they're getting spun like this better than the average person? Or take people before they start pole dancing training and then have them go through pole dancing training and see, does that change afterwards? But what I also want to say is that even if it turns out that pole dancers don't have any better spatial acuity, that's actually not the end of the story. Because in my most recent paper that I published, surprisingly, what I found was that there was no correlation between how accurately people trigger press and how well they actually balanced in the disorienting space-like condition. I mean, there were some people in that space-like condition who really could not do it at all. And I felt that maybe these were the people who just didn't have any sense of where they are in space. But I did not find a strong correlation. What I did find, and this is sort of a simplification of what I found, my actual finding is a little bit nuanced, but just as an overview, what I found is that those people who are most negatively affected by vestibular stimulation. So for example, those people who are most negatively affected by being spun, they were the ones who performed poorly in the spaceflight condition in the early trials. And to a certain extent, this makes sense. If you can't handle these like unusual spinning, disorienting environments, then early on, when everything is confusing and panic is coming onto you because you're disoriented and you don't know where you are, you can't trust your senses, you have to allocate huge amounts of attention to figure out where you are, you're probably not going to do too well. The second experiment that I think would be really interesting is, would pole dancers who are used to this type of disorientation actually perform better when I submerge them into the space-like condition immediately, and see, do they perform better in those first like few minutes than the average person who may not have ever experienced being disoriented in that sort of way. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. And the next speaker will be Joel, who is an amazing research scientist in the same lab, the Ashton Graybiel Spatial Orientation Lab. And he is interested in motion sickness. So I'm going to hand it over to him. Cool. And Joel, you are ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, do it.
All right. So, thank you, Vivek. And as he said, I work at Brandeis University in the Graybiel lab, and I study motion sickness. And so I make people sick for a living. It's a strange occupation, but it's for science. So motion sickness is a very complicated phenomenon and would take several hours to do it justice. So I'm going to just limit myself to things that are relevant to pole dancing and further limit it to mainly nausea when talking about motion sickness. Motion sickness is a syndrome with many different symptoms. And the predominant one people concentrate on is nausea, and which leads to vomiting, and you can understand that. It's the one that is most unpleasant and disruptive. But I want to spend a minute on another symptom of motion sickness. It's a very early symptom and an important one. It's called the SOPITE syndrome, SOPITE. And that happens very early on in motion sickness, and it's associated with a feeling of malaise or apathy, lethargy, sleepiness, okay? And sadistic parents rock their children to sleep by inducing motion sickness in them, and this is the SOPITE system that puts them to sleep. Anyway, that will come up again. I'll get back to that later. But now I'm going to, whenever I talk about motion sickness from now on, I'm talking about nausea. All right, so what are the theories of motion sickness? Let me put up, if I could share my screen. Am I sharing a screen? So
You are, Joel. It's awesome.
okay. All right, so theories of motion sickness. First of all, this is not a theory of motion sickness, but theories of motion sickness have to account for the fact that you need a functioning vestibular system to get motion sick. If you cut the vestibular nerve, for example, or you have some serious defects in your vestibular system, for all practical purposes, you cannot be made motion sick. And in fact, when they were talking about motion sickness is a serious thing for astronauts, for example, if they get motion sick on an EVA and throw up in their spacesuits, that could be fatal. And it was even suggested that they cut the vestibular nerve in astronauts before they put them up there. Of course, they wouldn't be able to walk afterwards, so that's kind of serious. And they fortunately didn't go that route. All right, so the most common theory of motion sickness nowadays is the conflict theory. There have been many theories of motion sickness, but this is the predominant one these days. And that simply states that if you have two sensory systems in the body and they're giving you conflicting information, that's going to be sickening, nauseating. And the two sensory systems that are mostly put in conflict are the visual system and the vestibular system. And the classic example is if you have a person below decks in a ship and the ship is moving up and down in heavy seas, their visual system will tell them they're not moving because the ship is moving up and down with them, but their vestibular system, the otoliths in particular, will tell them they're moving, and that's going to cause a conflict, and that's going to make you sick. All right, so I'm not a big fan of the conflict theory, not because it's wrong, because it's very useful to think about sensory conflicts because they are very often involved in nauseating stimuli, but because it's incomplete, because there are a lot of nauseating situations where you cannot identify any sensory conflict. And there are other situations where you can identify a conflict and it doesn't produce motion sickness. So it has its own problems. All right, so that, as I said, is the most common theory, and now the least common theory of motion sickness, because it's I'm the only one that really knows about this one, is the jerk theory of motion sickness. So first of all, I have to define jerk. So you know what steady motion is in a straight line. And that's called speed or velocity, and that will not make you sick. So, all right, so if you're in an airplane going 600 miles an hour in calm air, that doesn't make you sick at all. So velocity alone is not a causative factor of motion sickness. And it's actually also true for acceleration, which is the change in velocity. We're all familiar with that. You step on the gas and you accelerate faster. And another example is if I put people, we have a 22-foot diameter slow rotation room in the lab that can spin at 35 RPM. So if I put someone, seat them at the wall in that room and spin the room at 30 RPM, they will be under, the centrifugal force will be about, I don't know, between 2 and 3 Gs. So 2 or 3 times the force of the acceleration of gravity. Also, just sitting on the earth, and that will not make them sick as long as they don't move. And just sitting on the earth, we're under 1 G of acceleration constantly, and that doesn't make you sick. So, but really what makes you sick is when you change acceleration, and that's called jerk. I think it's called jerk because it feels like a jerk. Anyway, so linear or angular jerk is provocative, and it's only when you have jerk will you get sick if you eliminate vision. If you have vision alone, there are certain visual situations that'll make you sick. But if you eliminate all other senses as much as you can anyway, you must have a jerk, linear or angular, in order to produce motion sickness. Let's see if I said everything I want to do about that. Oh yes, as obvious as that is, I have never seen that in print. And please don't rush to publish this before I do, because I want to be famous someday. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is a special nauseating case of motion sickness, and it has the fancy name of Coriolis cross-coupling stimulation. And that just means that you have a rotating person and you change the axis of rotation while they are rotating. And you can see where I'm going with that and how it's related to spinning in pole dancing. And I have an example here. Here we have Hannah sitting in a rotating chair. And this is an experiment I've run on for hour after hour. Vivek has been in it for many, many unpleasant hours as well. So she's going to be, by the way, can you see my my pointer here? Yes, okay, good. So she's going to rotate around this vertical axis. That's the primary axis of rotation. And when I say now, she's going to tilt her head forward. And that's going to be the secondary axis of rotation. And that's going to produce Coriolis cross-coupling. All right. So I won't go into the details, but Coriolis doing that causes a very large jerk in the canal system, in the canal system. Remember I said jerk is required. This is a big jerk. And the signals that are coming out of the canals will conflict with the signals that are coming from the otoliths. So within the vestibular system, there's a conflict. So both of those theories that I mentioned, the conflict theory and the jerk theory, are both going to say this is going to be a very provocative situation. And it is. I mean, I can put people in this chair and rotate them at high speeds, have them make these head movements. They're feeling fine, and I can put them in the bag in less than a minute. All right. Now, in this case, Hannah is not particularly susceptible to, she's almost insusceptible, the least susceptible person I've tested. So she does not get sick from doing this. And you'll notice when I start her spinning, when she makes her first head movement, she makes a slight vocalization. And the reason for that is Coriolis cross-coupling stimulation produces a bizarre sensation of rolling, yawing, and tumbling. And most people will find that very unpleasant and nauseating. Hannah likes it, and that's why she makes that vocalization. Okay, so here we go.
I'm recording now. 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 Now.
Okay, so as I said, that's very provocative for most people. That's why I used her for this demo. I didn't want to torture people unnecessarily, which I do a lot. All right, so is there anything else? Again, I said that causes a very large jerk in the canals. All right, so now I want to move on to motion sickness susceptibility. So given that you have some sickening stimulus, what are the factors that determine how sick someone is going to be? In the SAD model, there are 3 factors. Number 1, S is obviously sensitivity, how sensitive they are to the given stimulus. How sensitive are they to Coriolis cross-coupling? How sensitive are they to up and down motion in the ship at sea? And people vary by a factor of 10 to 1 in their sensitivity, approximately across the population. So some people are 10 times more sensitive to a given stimulus than another. And not only that, there's not only that difference, but if you have stimulus A, B, and C, some people will rank those as being provocative in that order, A, B, and C, but others will rank them as being a different order, B, C, or A. So sensitivity varies quite a bit across subjects. The next factor is adaptation, and that's how fast the sensitivity changes with repeated exposures to a given stimulus. So if their adaptation constant is 1, the second time I give them that stimulus, they give me the same increment in nausea. So they're not adapting essentially at all. And by the way, what I mean by adaptation is a change in sensitivity, not just a decrease. It can be an increase in sensitivity. If their adaptation constant is 0.5, then the second exposure will be half as provocative as the first. If their adaptation constant is 2, then the second exposure will be twice as provocative. They're being sensitized to the stimulus. All right, so again, this varies by at least a factor of 10 across subjects in the population. And the last factor, D, is decay. And that is, given someone is nauseous, how fast does that nausea decay away? And that varies, it's the most variable, by a factor of 200 to 1. So I have some people who decay, their nausea decay constant is about 6 seconds. And I have others that decay is before 4 or 5,000 seconds. So it varies tremendously across subjects. And I like to say this part because it really annoys Jana. It's not particularly, it's not politically correct. There's a correlation between race and motion sickness susceptibility, and mainly in this decay factor. I find Asian people have those very long decay constants of 3,000 or 4,000 seconds. But again, this is a general statement about populations. They're normally distributed and the populations overlap a lot. And Hannah, for example, as you may have noticed, is Asian, and her decay constant is not excessively long. And in fact, she's the most unsusceptible person I ran in my last study. All right, what else do I want to say about that? Oh yeah, there are other factors that are involved in susceptibility, but these are the 3 big ones, the 3 main ones. And again, if any one of these 3 factors is low, if sensitivity is low, adaptation is low, or decay is low, you will have low susceptibility to motion sickness. But unfortunately, most of us are in the middle area of these, and so we will all be susceptible. Most of us will be susceptible to motion sickness. And the other surprising thing is if these sad factors are independent of one another, and I don't know that for sure, although it appears to be the case, haven't collected enough data to be sure, then motion sickness varies by more than 10,000 to 1 across the population. Motion sickness susceptibility, I mean. So you multiply 10 times 10 times 200, that's 20,000, but it's more than 10,000 anyway. And that is the most variable property of human beings I've ever seen. Obviously, height and weight don't vary by 10,000 to 1 across the population. All right, now I want to deviate from motion sickness for 1 minute to talk about disorientation. And here's a top view of our rotating room I mentioned before. It's 22 feet in diameter. And this room only locks down with door A at the ramp. So that's the way I almost always, or people almost always enter this room. But once it was locked down at door B for maintenance purposes. And I walked in this room and equipment that I had been working on for 2 weeks, which was over here, was now in my frame of reference over here because the room, this door B was at the ramp. So right and left were reversed. And that is surprisingly disorienting. And that's related to pole dancing because when you saw Liz go inverted on the pole, left and right reversed. So that's very, that in itself is very disorienting. All right, so what are the treatments for motion sickness? I'll go through those quickly. Drugs are very common one. Promethazine and scopolamine are probably the most effective, but people vary tremendously in their what they respond to. Bonine and Dramamine are also used a lot. Promethazine and scopolamine can be injected, and the advantage of that is once a person is sick, you can help their motion sickness by giving them an injection. Bonine and Dramamine and scopolamine also are usually given orally, and or scopolamine with the scopolamine patch behind the ear. But those must be given at least an hour before they're exposed to the nauseating stimulus, because once you get sick, your stomach shuts down and the active ingredients will not get into your bloodstream. So you have to take these drugs beforehand. All right, another very effective, almost equally effective treatment for motion sickness is the placebo effect. If I give someone a sugar pill, and this is just amazing to me sometimes, I've run experiments and told people that they were given something which of course was nothing effective, and that will cure their motion sickness and prevent them from getting sick. And copper bracelets, electrical wrist stimulation, and there's a whole bunch of these things that people claim helps motion sickness, and I know people that swear by these. I hate to tell them that it's all a placebo effect and they could have saved a lot of money. But anyway, placebo effect is in motion sickness is one of the largest places where you'll see it. So what are the relevance of these things to pole dancing? Well, first of all, sad factors are obviously going to be very important. As I said, if the sad factors are low, you will be not very likely to get motion sick in most situations. Linear jerk and angular jerk. Linear jerk, you're not going to find much of that in pole dancing, but angular jerk, you may well find that. Most of the examples that Liz showed were small angular jerk, small levels, so they won't be provocative. The one exception to that is the one where she rotates and then becomes inverted, and I'll talk about that later. We'd like to avoid Coriolis cross-coupling stimulation while pole dancing if you can. Obviously, doing a flip like she did is going to give you Coriolis cross-coupling stimulation. Disorientation will accompany this. It'll give you that bizarre rolling and tumbling sensation. Sensory conflict is going to happen in the vestibular system alone if you do cross-coupling. But again, if you go inverted, you're going to get the right and left reversal problem. There's also a difference in active and passive, whether you initiate the motion or the motion is provided by a separate mechanical means. Your body treats those two situations very differently. And there's conditioned nausea to worry about. If you get on the pole and every time you get there, you get sick, after a while, just seeing that pole is going to make you sick. And then even if you don't get, nausea, severe nausea, doing a lot of pole dancing with where there's cross-coupling stimulation can result in that fatigue soapite syndrome. All right, so how can you prevent motion sickness? Well, one of the most effective means is if you could pick your parents that have genes which have small SAD factors. So that's kind of hard to do unless you have a time machine. Drugs, as I said, work with most, but not all people, but they have side effects. So you will not do your best performance probably because you will have some lethargy and fatigue as a side effect from the drugs. If you're going to make provocative movements, especially Coriolis cross-coupling movements, they should be made slowly if possible. And the secondary head movement should be of lower amplitude. And both the primary and secondary angular velocities should be low if possible. You want to minimize jerk if possible. Also, if you have a number of provocative moves in your routine, you might want to space them out to give decay time to work. Decay is a very effective nausea reducer in some people. And you may want to put them at the end of the program because the nausea that develops may sensitize you to other movements which were not provocative earlier on. Eyes open versus closed, you might want to explore that because that can affect whether it increases or decreases nausea, and that varies depending on the exact stimulation being experienced. And finally, another method is when you do these motions repeatedly, you tend to adapt so that they won't be as provocative the next time you do it. And that adaptation is usually not long lasting. It may last a week or two, all right, no more than that. So if you take a vacation from your pole dancing and go back, you may go back to ground zero. All right, so I want to go back to that video now with the things I've discussed and why to take another look at it and see in this particular one, this is the one where she spins, where Liz spins and then does that inverted flip. First of all, as you'll see when I start this video, she's spinning at about 25 RPM. And when I run subjects, I normally spin them at, and I want to make them sick, I normally spin them at 15 RPM. So she's way up there in speed. And remember, I said you want to make those the secondary rotation slowly. Well, she makes it very rapidly, and not only that, it's a huge rotation. She rotates completely inverted. All right, so let me just start that again. So she's about 25 RPM here. And whenever she tilts her head away from that pole, that's going to give her some Coriolis cross-coupling stimulation, like there. All right. All right. And now when she does the big movement, 180 degrees flip here, that is really going to whomp her vestibular system. And then she rights herself, which smacks it again. All right. So most of the spinning she showed, all of the spinning that videos she showed, except this one, I don't see as being very provocative. You know, they don't involve much jerk, and they don't involve much cross-coupling stimulation, except when she tilts her head back from the pole. But this one is really a masochistic one to, to do. All right, so the last thing I wanted to show you before I quit, well, first of all, here's a blown up diagram of what the vestibular system looks like. This is about 25 times actual size. This is the eardrum. Here's the cochlea, which does the transduction from vibration into nerve impulses, and then the three canals. And the otoliths are in here, this part of the vestibular system. Now here is a graduate student who failed his qualifying exams, but we found another use for him. So here is here's the ear canal, and this bone has been removed behind the ear canal where the vestibular system lives. And in there, you can see those blue those blue curves. Those are the canals. They've been highlighted with ink, and this whole system is less than a dime across, and people don't even know they have it. When they list the senses that people have, they list the 5 cardinal systems, 5 cardinal senses, vision, smell, audition, taste, and I don't know what I left out, but the 5. And we actually have more than 10 senses, depending on how you count them. And the vestibular ones are extremely important, because without these, most people don't even know they have them. You could not stand or walk normally. And with that, I turn it back to you, Vivek.
All right. Well, thank you, Joel, and thank you to all of the speakers. So what I'll do is I'll stop recording. Are you sure you want to start recording?